almost everything has data right now, right? So it could be government, or it could be activism, or it could be literature or arts or healthcare, or, there's just so many different fields. So find your interest and apply data skills. At Ancestry, the users, they can create family trees, and they have over 100 million family trees, which corresponds to more than 13 billion historical people that are described in all the family trees combined. So under the hood, there's actually a ton of data science, a ton of machine learning.
Hello, and welcome to the Teens and AI podcast. My name is Kate, and I'm your host for today's episode, where we're talking to Dr Ahna Girshick about her passion for exploring the relationship between humanity and AI, both through her work at Ancestry, combining data science and family history, and her work in combining AI with music and art. We hope you enjoy. I wondered whether we could just start by you telling us a little bit more about yourself, your background in both sort of STEM and the arts, and your career journey so far.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I feel really fortunate because I came from a family that really valued both arts and sciences. My dad was a scientist engineer. My mom was an abstract painter. So I really kind of grew up surrounded by both visual arts and like math and sciences. And actually, as I got older, I kind of noticed with some reluctancy and disappointment that the world often doesn't work that way. Like our educational systems, our professions are very, very specialized. And that was actually personally kind of hard for me, and still is sometimes a struggle. But my career arc has really been around trying to kind of secretly connect those areas. So I've kind of focused, like I was a computer science major, and I went on and did neuroscience. So I focused a lot on technology. I worked in the tech industry, but my interest has always been very cross-disciplinary around how to apply that technology to experiences not only that benefit humans, but are kind of uniquely human. And so how to like complement our humanness with technology.
And I think you've really touched on something that a lot of people experience. They're not ready to just go into one field. So we are always trying to balance it, but it is very hard. And I wonder what it was like for you to begin studying formally in such a male-dominated field, and what your experience has been like as a woman in STEM.
Right. So, I've spent a lot of time in different labs and had actually a range of experiences. What I've found personally very useful is, observing successful female role models, whether or not it's from close up or afar. Sometimes we don't always have the opportunity to get really close to people, famous people, but you can still observe and, learn what you can from each of them, right? Like, I think I've worked with females who I really admire, but I would never be able to work in their style. So there's no one size fits all. I think, it's kind of important to be authentic to yourself and what feels right, and kind of draw inspiration in a range of skills and try on different hats from different role models, male or female, that said.
And I think it's really interesting that with role models, they don't have to be the perfect person who you aspire to be exactly like. But if there's something in someone that you see and you admire, then it's really important to have that and to have them as almost goals.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so when you were at school, for us, a lot of our listeners think about going to school to do STEM subjects, but are kind of put off by the fact they think they'll be the only one. So were you put off by that, or were you just ready to go because it was your passion?
That's a good question. I'm trying to even remember. I don't think I was put off by that. But the experience wasn't always easy, that said, right? And I think part of what I struggled with was sometimes understanding like technical concepts that I felt like I should understand, but that were explained in a culture that I didn't quite get. Like scientific papers and technical papers, like they're very abstract, very often mathematical, statistical. And I've spent my life poring over these papers, even writing some of them myself, but like, it's a language that like doesn't speak to everybody. And it didn't naturally speak to me even. And so when you're in a culture where you don't connect to that language, that can be a challenge, but it's also a growth opportunity and learning experience, right? So for me, that was kind of more of the struggle than being the only female. Like I was always with very working with amazing male colleagues who I learned a lot from as well. And I think the important part for me to always remind myself is like not to try to mold myself in their model, right? Not necessarily try to become more like them, but to learn what I could from them and try to stay authentic and true to myself.
Sometimes when we think about all these balances, we're like, oh well, there's no other women, so what is there a place for me, is there space for me? But a lot of men are allies,
yes,
are
absolutely,
and enthusiastic about getting other women in STEM. So I think it's really about encouraging a balance and not just viewing it as only a problem, you know. And
when you bring other viewpoints to the room, like people appreciate that a lot. So it's something for women to remember is like, it's intimidating to speak up, but by doing so, you actually help everybody. People appreciate that.
Definitely. I think sometimes when we think about it, we're like, oh, no one wants to hear what I have to say. And I think that's kind of a mindset that women and young girls get into far too early.
I had that issue myself when I was younger, for sure. I think it's taken me years to kind of get over that more, but as I have, I've felt like it was worth it.
It just unlocks so many more doors and so many.
Yes.
It's so much more fun.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can have a conversation, right? Versus just staying quiet in the back of the room.
And of course you then moved on to get your doctorate, right?
Right. Yeah.
So what did you decide to do that on?
So again, I was a little torn. What do I want to do? I had studied computer science as an undergraduate and been very attracted to the parts of computer science that interacted with humans. So that's AI and human computer interaction, and even like some cognitive psychology. So I found this PhD program at UC Berkeley, which was called Vision Science, which is kind of unique to UC Berkeley. I think at other schools, the same type of research happens, but it's not labeled that. So what it was interdisciplinary between computer science, psychology, neuroscience, and a few other fields. And really the focus of that program was around understanding vision. So in the human brain or a biological brain, also in a computer, really a cross between all those things I was interested in. And of course, I was still interested in art. So I did a lot of my doctoral research on understanding how people perceive three-dimensional sense of depth in a two-dimensional image. So a 2D image is like a photo, a painting, a computer screen. They're all around us, or, we kind of take it for granted. But when you look at a photograph, for example, there's a 3D image in it that's been captured from a particular viewpoint where the camera is, and then your eyes are no longer at the same position as where that camera was, but your brain just compensates and figures it out anyway. And you say, oh, that's a picture of, New York City with all the buildings and depth that has, right? And there's no problem there. We do it instantly. And so I did a lot of like laboratory research with humans. I did a lot of mathematical modeling, collecting data. Of course, we never had as much data as people have today. And this turns out to be kind of a almost philosophical question that Leonardo da Vinci was asking 500 years ago, right? And so we were able to, through doing kind of systematic research, come up with an understanding of how our brain is doing that.
I'm now all I'm doing is I'm just staring at the Zoom screen thinking, well, I see you in your flat, but you're right. I can see your back door or the light coming through or the mirror in it's you really something you don't even realize you're thinking about. And it's amazing that, data is used to research that problem, and data can be used in so many different ways. And it's used in so many ways, as you said, that we might not expect. And one of the great things about being able to work with it is I guess that it can take you into so many different areas, and it's taking you into so many different realms.
Yeah. I think that's one of the awesome things about data science right now, is that it's this field where you can really apply data science to anything. Like almost everything has data right now, right? So it could be government, or it could be activism, or it could be literature or arts or healthcare, or, there's just so many different fields. So find your interest and apply data skills. It's very, very broad.
It's interesting because I think data skills is something that is encapsulated into the subjects we do in school. We look at maths and we look at science, and we think about, how are you using your evidence and where are you getting your evidence from in all kinds of subjects. But sometimes I feel like we don't tell people this is data skills, these are what you're gaining.
Yeah. And actually, like, I never knew I had any data skills when I was in school. So I was in a very academic program that everybody was mostly getting trained to become a professor. And that's at least still quite traditional in some PhD programs. And then I was a postdoc in a similar situation. But it turns out there aren't enough faculty jobs for most PhDs. There's very few. And so what I noticed as I was finishing my postdoc was that there was this new field called data science coming up around that time. And a lot of my lab mates all started realizing that they had the right skills for these jobs, even though we didn't know that. We didn't know we were data scientists. We had never seriously knew much about machine learning. I think at that time that in an academic lab, even the term machine learning was some kind of taboo because it was just seen as unprincipled, uninterpretable, not real science, just kind of like throwing a black box at a problem and maybe getting high performance, but not really understanding why. Of course, we didn't have much data back then, but very quickly, all these PhDs like figured out how to become successful data scientists and realized their skills were totally applicable to the machine learning. In fact, most of machine learning came out of statistical models. So many of these scientists have the right training.
Now I'm just thinking back over all the people that we've chatted to on the podcast. When I think about their titles, they are all doctors. And I think the traditional job market is moving so fast away from that, what you're told as a child, a fireman, a doctor, a policeman, a dancer, and I think I wonder whether we will have children who are growing up saying, yeah, I want to be a data scientist. I don't know, but I wonder. And one of the places that your doctorate took you to is Ancestry. And I think of Ancestry as a website that enables me to kind of build and discover my family tree and send a picture of it to my family, right? But it's actually much more than that. And I was wondering, could you tell us a bit about what Ancestry does and what it is you did while you were there?
Yeah, sure. So I had the privilege of working there first as a computational research scientist, then later as a research manager in Ancestry's DNA science research lab. So I was there for nearly 5 years. No longer there. So it's a 40-year-old company about. The main focus is family history. And, your first reaction might be like, that's my great Uncle Bob that cares about genealogy, but like, I don't really care. And I was in that boat when I joined. But then, I'm also a data nerd, and I realized that like family trees are just this amazing source of data. They're spatial. Well, they're spatial and they're temporal. So the temporal part is like if you make a chart of you and then your parents and their parents and brothers, sisters, and their parents going all the way back. And when they were born and when they died, suddenly you have this map back in time. And then you can also add where they lived, where they were born, where they died, where they lived in between. And so that starts to create this real picture. And it's like a journey, right? Of who your family was and where they came from. And so at Ancestry, the users, they can create family trees, and they have over 100 million family trees, which corresponds to more than 13 billion historical people that are described in all the family trees combined. So under the hood, there's actually a ton of data science, a ton of machine learning, just to organize that data, but also to enable this like wonderful customer experience where they use machine learning to make relevant suggestions about who might be in your family and what historical records might have been theirs. Ancestry has been in the business for a long time of digitizing and indexing historical records. A lot of them are in the public domain, but they're very hard to access on your own. They're handwritten. Like the census documents from a few hundred years ago, handwritten. And, I have photos of census documents from 150 years ago that have my ancestors, and it says their name and their occupation and where they live and all this, right? And so what Ancestry does is they invested a lot in optical character recognitions, OCR, and particularly for this very scrawling, old-fashioned handwriting that I can't even read myself. And so that was the data science and machine learning that I was kind of referring to, of organizing a lot of this data. So they can help customers find historical people that they're connected to. It's really amazing, actually.
Yeah.
The power of an image. Like, it's one thing to say your ancestor was John Smith in this year, but it's another thing to see it in this document and see it was handwritten. It was clearly in like a small town in the corner of Ireland. And it was, you could see their jobs, the kids, that, how educated they were, all these things in a photograph. So that's a big part of Ancestry. The other part is DNA. So DNA is another way to understand your past. And for some people, it's the only way to understand their past. If they're adopted and they might not know who their parents were, or even if you know who your parents were, most people only know going back a couple of generations, whereas DNA can tell you going back thousands of years. So my research was actually on combining these two data sources. So history and biology, or history and genetics, right? And so, like, we talked about specialization in school, and those are two areas which are generally totally separate. And so here's an opportunity in data science to combine these two topics. And I think when you can find interesting data sets to combine that make sense in this case, it's a great opportunity. So it was very cross-disciplinary. I worked with people that are genealogists, epidemiologists, geneticists, all combined. And so I can tell you a little bit about the research project that I call it data storytelling, of how you combine these sources of data. So stories are like this very uniquely human format for communicating information. So that's what I liked about it. You can trace it back 5,000 years. Even when I was a new mother, I discovered my little baby hearing stories, right? So I think it's very human, and we're just kind of wired to be captivated to this. And I think for your listeners, when they can think about putting their data in a storytelling format, it might be a good way to connect to their audience. And so, and it also kind of fit into my career arc of really wanting to connect AI and the human experience. So we generated these unique data-driven stories for every DNA customer. So it's over 18 million customers. So you have to think about, when you have that many people and you want to make it unique, how to do it in a very automated way. But that's very personal. So it's personalized with their own DNA, which connects them into a social network. But it's not a social network exactly like Facebook. It's more, it's similar. The people are the individuals, and instead of friendships connecting them, it's their genetic relatedness. So it's how much DNA they share. So I share a lot of DNA with my sister. So we're right next to each other on that graph. And you and I might be further in that graph because, well, who knows? I'm part Irish, and that's kind of on your side of the world. So,
yeah, I think I've got a little bit of Irish probably in there, and a bit of Ashkenazi Jew.
Oh, so do I, actually.
Great. So
we might be cousins, right? And so actually, so that's a funny surprise. But what we do with that graph is we actually find clusters of people who are close in the graph. And so you don't have to be brother and sister to be close. You probably need to have your most recent common ancestor, maybe 8 generations ago. So 8 generations a while back. Most people don't know 8 generations ago. And that can be many degrees out of cousins. And in the past 200 years, people have migrated all over the world, right? A lot. And so most people don't know everyone in that group, but we call those clusters genetic communities. And this is, there's a lot you can read about social network analysis and community detection algorithms, or clustering algorithms, but I won't go into that so much. It gets kind of technical. But I think one of the challenges we face that is kind of unique here and might be applicable to others is pretty interesting. So at this point, what I've told you is we have a cluster of people, of living people who we know are related. But what about that? Like, who are these people? What is the story that people really want to make it personal? So we needed to kind of connect that biology to the history, right? And so that's two different data sets. And so the way we did this is some of those people have made their family trees. And so we can create basically an aggregated family tree. These are anonymized family trees. We're not looking at any particular person's family tree, but in aggregate, when you have thousands and thousands of them, you can kind of see the pattern. And so think about it like traveling back in time from the present and going back like every decade. And at each time point in this journey, you can determine the most likely birth locations of those ancestors in that community. And so this is like our plot line of our story, right? So it's calculated, it's all automated, but it's a plot line where you track people across the globe. And it's actually very consistent with history books, but in some ways more precise, because it's so much data. Nobody has ever really done this before. So you could, just for an example, you can think of like a cluster of individuals who are currently living in the American Midwest state of Ohio or somewhere, but their ancestors are all coming from a corner of Germany. And decade by decade, we can trace back that path. Of course, not every person has the exact same story, but there's a trend. And then there's a lot of towns in Ohio and Germany along the way that are connected to that group of individuals. And so we designed these so each person, gives like less than a teaspoon of their saliva, and they might know nothing about their family tree, and they can learn about how they're connected to one or more of these genetic communities. I'm in like 5 or 6 of them. So I call that, data storytelling. I think that kind of gives you a taste of how you can connect genetics and history really nicely.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's really fascinating in the way that data can be used to tell us about the past and not only the future. I think at the moment there's so much talk about what will AI enable us to do moving forward, and what does it enable us to do to make our lives easier and our lives better. But actually, what can it do to tell us about things that we actually don't have the relics, the artifacts to be able to find out about? And so I'm kind of wondering, how can what we then find out about the past, how does that then help us in the future?
Right. I mean, there's so much happening right now in genetics in terms of personalized healthcare and tailoring diagnoses and treatments to individuals based on their genetics. So that's a huge area. I mean, I think for me, like the first step there is just, there's so much divisiveness and hatred in the world right now. And a lot of it just comes from this misguided belief about like our differences, when in fact humans share like over 99.5% of their DNA. We're so much more similar than we're different. And I think a lot of people are very attached to like, I'm from this place, I'm not like them. Only to, to learn that like, if you take a DNA test, like no one is purebred, right? We're all like DNA goes back to the beginning of the human species, right? And so I think just kind of on a more human level of connectedness, it's very beautiful, like what one could do if one understood this and felt like, okay, we're all actually connected. We're a common species. So I hope I hope people realize this.
And I was also wondering about how your work, did it change at all as a result of COVID? Because I know there's been so much talk about genetics in COVID and how people of different ethnicities have reacted to the disease in so many different ways. So I was wondering whether Ancestry had come into that in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, actually. So, when COVID hit, it was actually, I want to say that it's almost exactly a year today. That was the day that our office closed down. We all went home thinking it was just going to be a couple of weeks. So like on a personal level, that's very memorable. My daughter's school closed, all of that we all went through. But within a few weeks, in April of 2020, our team, we're the science team, all very motivated to contribute to the scientific understanding of COVID. And so we launched a research study. We had nearly 1 million participants join. These are Ancestry DNA customers who volunteered to be part of the study, and were also very motivated to contribute their COVID experience for the sake of, improving the science around it. It was a very cross-disciplinary study. We had, data scientists, genetic epidemiologists, et cetera, all contributing. And we were able to discover some very interesting patterns. And like a lot of scientists, contribute to that scientific conversation. So the patterns were around specific genetic variants, which are more likely to be associated with either COVID susceptibility or severity, as well as kind of lifestyles and other risk factors that are associated.
And of course, AI runs on data, and data which, it's anonymized, but it belongs to individuals. And for the next generation, this use of data is only going to increase across the world to enable the technology that we're creating to work. So how do we make sure that the people who are going to be in charge of that data are responsible for it and aware of it and care about the people behind it?
Yeah, you hit on a fantastic question that's super important. And I think it's a question we have to just keep asking every day. So especially the people that have their hands on the data, a lot of people in your audience are aspiring to data careers. So on the one hand, like one of the awesome things about AI is it's so powerful. You can use it to improve lives, complement humanity in fantastic and exciting ways. And that just comes with this enormous responsibility to be ethical. And so it's not just to be ethical oneself, but to make sure that your work is not going somewhere where it can really be used unethically. So we have to hold ourselves to really high standards and keep asking. And I think it's quite tricky now because we don't always know where we can't imagine future applications. In retrospect, it's easy to think about it, but from today's vantage point, it's often tricky to know, like, one could use this data to do X or Y, and things that I might not want to happen to myself or my mother or, someone that I care about. Like, it's one thing in the abstract, but when you actually think about your own data or someone close to you, their data, I think it becomes less comfortable. And so, I've always believed a lot in transparency. So transparency about how the data is collected, really being careful about anonymization and not just like scrubbing someone's name. That's usually not enough. You have to be more clever about how you protect privacy. And going back to transparency, actually, it's not just transparency about how the data is used, but transparency about how your algorithms work. And I think one of the exciting things in the field I've seen is, I mentioned at the beginning, this idea of the black box machine learning algorithm that does something amazing. We don't really understand it. But more and more, if you go to data science conferences now, there'll be a session on interpretability. So what is this doing and how does that work? And also, there'll be a session on data fairness or data ethics. Those are, for me, often the most interesting sessions at data science conferences right now. I think we just have to keep continuing that and improving our skills and tools around how we use data and that conversation.
I think you touched on something fascinating, that how your data is used, but also how the algorithm works. I think sometimes we think, oh yeah, data goes in, answer comes out, something happens in the middle. And it's something that perhaps we need to, as a society, understand more, even people who aren't working in data, so that they don't just think an algorithm is an algorithm. It becomes this mysterious word that no one really knows what it means. So I think that's really, really interesting. How do we explain not just the beginning and the end, but the middle, the two? And moving a bit further away from that, but we mentioned a bit earlier about your work with art and your work in creativity and artistry. And I'd love to chat a little bit about the relationship between AI and creativity, which is something that's increasingly being explored. Wayne McGregor has worked with AI in his choreography. It's being used much more often as a collaborator in music composition. A chair that AI helped design, I recently found out, was featured at Milan Design Week. And that's before we even enter into the realm of books. So what do you think about AI and creativity, and how have you explored this in the past in your work?
Yeah, so I mentioned this idea of having AIs really complement our humanity. So humans are by nature creative. Like I look at my daughter, she's so creative. That's her kind of biological mission, is to keep tinkering with what she knows and combine it in new ways, right? And I think sometimes as adults, we often get stuck a little bit with creativity, or we feel like, oh, I'm so uncreative, right? It's like really hard to look at a blank canvas, right? But if you have some starting point, sometimes it's a little bit easier, right? Because if you have a set of knobs to turn, you start feeling like, oh, I can do that, and then you end up discovering something, and that experience, I think people really value. They really value it. So actually, in 2011, I had the opportunity to collaborate with several different musicians and produce the series of interactive musical data visualizations, which I think really encourage creativity in that sense. So some of the artists were, Bjork, Philip Glass, Beck, Metric, a few others. And these experiences were really around rethinking that musical experience is not something passive that you put your headphones on and keep switching stations, right? But really something that you're engaged into. And I'm actually not a musician. This wasn't geared towards musicians, but you can engage with music and even add to it if you have the right tools available to you. So we created these audio visual touchscreen experiences. Remember, this is about a decade ago, so iPads and iPhones were all new. But they really encourage that experimentation. So just an example with Philip Glass, who's an amazing American composer. If you don't know him, he's done a lot of soundtracks for films that you might have heard. But we built something called the Glass Machine, and it allowed people to experiment with the patterns that are encoded in his music. So these were, you could think of this as like the machine or the AI kind of knew those patterns. And then the human really controlled where it went, if that makes sense. So you can make music in his style that was your own. In a sense, you're collaborating with him directly. And so that was really fun. I think people felt the experience was very, very intimate almost, right? Like it's your own personal creation. And so giving people a taste of things like that, I found very satisfying.
I love that. No, with that, it connects you to someone that you would never really have that close of a connection to otherwise, right? Like I think of Philip Glass as someone I've looked at the manuscripts when I studied music, and he's there and he's on the page, but actually what he's all about is music. So to be able to use AI to hear him and to hear yourself and to collaborate in that way is something that's so powerful and so exciting.
Yeah, and more and more education has moved from like this rote passive learning into this engaged active experiential learning, and the reason for that is because a lot of people learn better when they're engaged and interactive and get to turn the knobs themselves. So if you want to understand Philip Glass music, getting to be able to turn those knobs yourself is very powerful, versus just hearing it in the background of a movie and having that experience, but maybe not really thinking about, what that is.
And with Bjork, what did you do with Bjork? Was it a similar thing?
Yeah, so with Bjork, she released this album called Biophilia, that in, I think, 2011-ish, which was actually first released as an app album. So apps were new back then. And so she collaborated with a bunch of artists and scientists. The theme of the album was actually about science. The app album allowed people to, again, engage with her music, kind of manipulate the song went, as well as understand. Each song was about a different scientific phenomenon. So understand the science behind it. So for example, one of them was around viruses. and to like understand how a virus works.
I think we could all do with a bit of that now. I need to re-listen to it. And I know that you've now left Ancestry and are looking to do more in the realm of artistry and data and AI and creativity and the intersection of all those worlds. So I was wondering, what is next for you? Do you have any future plans? Are you pondering? Are you thinking about it? What's next?
Yeah, that's right. So this year I'm kind of taking a break from working directly in the tech industry and, really to focus on my art, which has been on the back burner for quite a while. But actually it hasn't been a waste of time because I really want to draw my inspiration from concepts in AI. Maybe it's creating physical representations, and experiences that really show what a deep neural network is doing and how it relates to our world, but really through a different lens. So, I mentioned that there were times in my career where I kind of struggled through like these very technical research papers and how to understand it. And I just think that there are many ways to look at these concepts. We don't have to constrain ourselves to the academic language, for example. And so, great art has that power to show the world around us through a really different lens, take a step back, ask questions, and think about how it affects AI, in particular, how it affects our humanity. So there's lots of different angles you can have to have a career in AI, which I think could be actually inspiring for some of your listeners. So stay tuned for when I have more to share.
We absolutely can't wait to see what Ahna explores next in her work, and we'll keep you posted on our social media channels. So make sure you're following us at Teens in AI Pod on Instagram and Twitter. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Teens in AI podcast. Tune in next Thursday to hear from more leading figures in the world of AI. Until then, thanks for listening, and I hope you have a great day.